Welcome to the Behavioral Groups Podcast. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We interview interesting people in order to unlock insights into behavioral science and how we can apply them to work and life. Our episode today is with Koen Smets, originally from Brussels but living in the UK for the past 20 years. Koen has worked in a variety of corporate jobs over the years and is the founding partner of CareIQ, which offers innovative concepts for smart care in the healthcare markets.
We were interested in talking with Koen because of his great work and tweets about behavioral economics. His witty insights and unique perspective on the field brings a well-needed voice to the application of behavioral sciences.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Our conversation started by talking about the so-called Replication Crisis and Koen's thoughts on that. Then we talked a little bit about homogeneity and the actual differences between Europe and the US. Then we looped back and we talked about the difference between, or similarities, between behavioral economics and classical economics.
Yeah, and how that is a false dichotomy, or at least we think it should be, right. We move on to the differences that environment makes, not only in how we make decisions today, but in how our brain was formed and the worldview that environment makes, whether you grow up in Brussels and see the ocean, or whether you grow up in Switzerland and see mountains. Yeah. Then Koen points out that the need for organizations to test best practices and not just think that putting a best practice in place is going to get the exact same result that it got in another organization.
Absolutely. We wandered into some of Koen's papers, some of my favorites. One is There's More to Behavioral Economics Than Bias, and then my absolute favorite, which is An Accidental Behavioral Economist on Holiday.
On holiday? Isn't that a vacation?
It is in the U.S.,
okay.
But in the rest of the entire world, it's a holiday. And but this paper spoke to his insights on what it's like going to the same seaside town in the same flat year after year, and then noticing what happens to the surrounding businesses when a patisserie closes, or how the cost of street parking affects traffic and shopping, or how reputation and risk go together. Yeah, cool stuff.
Of course, Tim made sure that we ended up talking about music, which in this case was about jazz. But I have to say, I learned something. I learned about
what did you learn?
I learned about altered chords.
Good.
So people, you're going to have to listen to the entire conversation to find out what an altered chord is if you don't know what that is. So with that, sit back, relax, and enjoy our conversation with Koen Smets.
Welcome, Koen Smets, to our Behavioral Groups podcast this morning.
Well, thank you, and thanks for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here with you.
We are super excited to have you on the show today, and we always begin with a speed round where we just ask random questions. Want your quick, short responses on these, so if you're ready to go.
I was already afraid of that, but yes, I'm ready.
Most of our guests are. So I'll start here. Bike or unicycle?
Unicycle.
What's the best advice you got from your mother?
Be good.
Okay.
You a coffee drinker or a tea drinker?
Mostly tea. I'm in the UK.
That's one of the reasons we asked it.
Herbie Hancock or Chick Corea?
Chick Corea.
Says a lot right there.
All right. Replication crisis, real or overblown?
Overblown.
All right.
Let's dive right into that.
Yeah. So help us understand. So why would you say that the replication crisis is overblown? What are some of the background on that? And for listeners who don't know, there has been over the past 4 or 5 years, maybe even a little bit longer, a number of researchers who have gone out and looked to replicate some of the more famous studies that have been done in psychology as well as in other sciences. And many times they find that they cannot reproduce the same findings that they have.
John Bart
is a classic in the walking down a hallway after being primed to be thinking of old and having that being slow is kind of the main ones. And Brian Nozick is one of the leaders in this group. But Koen, help us understand your thoughts on why you think that's a little bit overblown.
Well, I think there are a few angles to this. I think one is that in my view, in social sciences, it's very hard to control all the circumstances of any environment. And so if you do a replication, then can you really be in control of all the circumstances? And if you're not, then it is not unlikely that you will find something else has happened than in the first instance of an experiment.
Right.
So is that necessarily a replication failure? Not in my view. I think when you try to replicate something, you need to be careful with what it is you want to replicate. And there are so many things, so many possible confounding factors that my feeling is that the term replication failure is wheeled out a bit too quickly. And in my view, the real value of a second experiment or a third or fourth experiment that doesn't totally replicate is, to me, the question, why not?
Right.
What is different between the different experiments? And I think it's too easy to say, well, it was pretty much the same. Well, pretty much is not good enough, I think. And to me, as a sort of an accidental student of human behavior, in a sense, I'm much more interested in what is not exactly as you expect it to be. And to me, that includes a replication. Something that replicates, well, it's just another data point. It's great. So probably whatever the initial study did is a bit more likely now. But my sense, especially in the last couple of years, is that the replication crisis has kind of created tribes. You have the believers of the original idea, and then you have the people who are so happy that they managed to tear something down. And I don't think that is necessarily helpful for scientific progress and for the scientific method. I think we should be less bolshy about the original idea. Hey, this is fantastic, and yeah, look at this, how quirky and crazy we are. But we should also not be as stark at the first non-replication of something and say, oh, look, this original thing was a complete load of BS. I think we need to be more nuanced on both sides, and then I think we will learn a lot more.
Yeah, I think that you bring up a couple different things. One, that the element of that scientific method, it isn't that really what we're actually doing. We're finding more data to either support or not support whatever that is. And your point of saying, yeah, if it's not an exact, if it's pretty close, but it's not exactly the replication, then it isn't the exact replication. And so you have those confounding factors.
New data points, yeah.
New data points. And I think to your point, I think there's an element of this that we tend to overgeneralize some of the bigger things, right? And so all of a sudden, yeah, for instance, Bark's study on this big piece of, ancient or, priming for, elderly kind of components, and then you generalize that into the broader sphere. Well, it was one study in one controlled area, and so you make sure that you do that. There was a hidden brain segment, and I don't know if you would have, but again, it was they brought up the research by Hackney and Amity. I think I just messed up their names, but it was about priming for either your gender, so female on taking a math test, or on your ethnicity.
Yeah, I know the study you refer to, yes.
Yeah, and so they found, in the original study, they found that when they primed for gender, women performed less well on a math test, and when they primed for ethnicity, Asian women, scored better. And then they replicated it, and it was Brian Nozick did this. And what was really interesting was in Georgia, they did two replication studies, one in Georgia and one in California. Mm-hmm. And the one in California didn't support the original. It found absolutely no thing. But the one in Georgia did support it. Mm-hmm. And so again, to your point, yep. Well, what is the culture in Georgia versus the culture in California?
Absolutely. I think culture is an important thing, and maybe this is something that us Europeans have as an advantage compared to many Americans. I mean, I've worked in probably 80% of all the European Union countries. And I mean, one of the things that doesn't cease to amaze me is I mean, I often do this kind of test when I'm going to another country. I sit on, stay on a terrace with a drink in the evening after a long day's work. I close my eyes and I ask myself, when you open your eyes, will you be able to tell which country you're in? And most of the time, I can. So I think there are people who say, oh, well, Europe is kind of becoming one big homogeneous mass of something. Nothing of the kind, in my experience at least. So this cultural diversity between regions within one country, but certainly between the Nordic countries and the Mediterranean countries and so on, all of that, I think, plays often a hidden part in creating a context, and this may influence why something works or not. And I think unless you're aware of that, you will easily be tripped up by a non-replication for a cultural factor that you're simply blind to. So I think we've had enough of the replication crisis. I think now we need to move on and grow out of this, in my view.
So your point is that when you go through this little experiment, you have a drink. I like the series, by the way. Have a drink, then close your eyes.
Yes.
Good start. You close your eyes, and then when you open your eyes, you can immediately tell. You're immediately aware of the differences from country.
Pretty much, yes. Yes, I mean, it's the architecture, it's the way people dress, it's how they, what they drive. Is there lots of public transport? Are the streets clean? Are there lots of trees? There's so many aspects that are different. And I mean, another thing, which of course you have in America just as much as the geography of countries can be very different. I do, and I have done a lot of work in the Netherlands, which is undoubtedly the flattest country in the world. I mean, more than half of it is actually below sea level.
Yeah.
So that's how flat it is. And then you compare this with Austria or Switzerland or the south of Germany, where you're in the mountains.
Yeah.
This must have an effect, an impact on how your worldview develops as a kid. You grow up and you can see 20 miles. I mean, all you can see is fields and the occasional tree in the Netherlands. And if you grow up in Zurich, then you look out of the window and you see a big mountain. You look through the back window, you see another big mountain. That's the kind of thing that shapes you in ways that you do not even realize. And in that light, I think it's not surprising that whatever experiment in social sciences you come up with is affected by those kind of influences.
Right. And I think that the couple pieces there that I just wanted to touch on. One is that in America, I think to your point, because we have this country that is supposedly one big country, as opposed to Europe where you got multiple countries, different languages and all the stuff that you talked about, we tend to assume that everybody's the same. And yet, I know when I go to New Orleans, or I go to San Diego, or I go to someplace out in Wyoming, they're very different cultures, but we don't necessarily take that into consideration as much as.
And yeah, one of my big complaints about travel today is that you can go to any of the big cities. You can go to Boston or New York or Atlanta or Los Angeles or Houston, and you're going to see the same Starbucks and Gap and Pottery Barn and the same retailers occupy those spaces in a way that I think is just, we're losing any kind of cultural diversity within the United States that once existed.
Yeah, to a degree.
I mean, as I said, this idea that there's some homogenization in Europe is alive here as well. Of course, the difference in languages is a big barrier to that. So it's not going to happen. We're not all going to start speaking English, certainly not after Brexit, French or some other language. I once toyed with the idea of writing a novel on the adventures of a guy who was tasked by the European Commission to prepare for the whole of Europe to speak Dutch. It's a crazy idea, but I don't think that's happening. And one of the nice things I think in Europe is that you can get some wine with McDonald's in France, because the French would not accept to go out for a meal and not have access to wine. So I think it's really nice to get McDonald's, yes, but it's McDonald's French style, or it's in Holland. Another thing, I don't know whether either of you have ever been to the Netherlands, but they have a weird delicacy there called croquettes. It's basically some kind of thickened meat stew rolled in breadcrumbs and deep fried. Now you can get a mac croquette in the Netherlands. It's basically a bun with a flat croquette. I love it. But you can only get it in the Netherlands. And I think this kind of localization of global stuff is what's happening. And I think it's great, this diversity. I think diversity is the secret weapon of us humans. It's because we are so diverse that we survive and we thrive in the way that we have more than any other species.
So we talk about how there's additional tribalization. There's more sub-tribalization going on. Do you think it is just a natural form of the human condition to bifurcate from whatever group was? I think about religion and faith, and if we follow the Judeo-Christian story, we start with Judaism, and then there's a branch that comes off for Christianity, and then during the Reformation, Christianity breaks into a Protestantism in a variety of different ways, and today there are hundreds and hundreds of different denominations of Christianity within the United States. Do you think that this is just a natural element of the human form, or is it possible we'll go back to something that's more less diverse?
I think it's probably a pendulum movement. I think it sort of swings one way and then swings back a bit the other way. I don't think we will move to some true homogeneity. I think there's too many things that different people are different in. Taste of music, taste in food, cultural affiliation, political affiliation, all that. I think when I talk about the pendulum, I think it's probably more about how this manifests itself. I think, well, I live in a country which was not that long ago still partially torn by, at least nominally, religious strife in Northern Ireland. Although we should not exaggerate this. I think it's not as if the Protestants and the Anglicans could really fighting all the time. There was a lot of politics and even crime involved, sort of drug smuggling and weapon smuggling and all that kind of thing. But I think it is perfectly possible to be diverse without needing to fight each other. You can just say, well, I have a different opinion, but we can live next to one another, and that's great. I think the pendulum has been swinging, and I hope it will stop swinging in this direction soon, towards more hostility between different tribes. It's not enough to be different. There is a sense that you're superior, and therefore you have a right to dominate the others. And I think that's not only very unpleasant, it's also not very helpful. I don't think anybody gets better from it. So I think it's a byproduct of our quest for diversity and for carving out identities in whatever way. I mean, I wrote about identities a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And I think it also comes up in this whole replication crisis, just to sort of loop back a little bit there. There is a sort of, it even started with behavioral economics, in the sense that, these neoclassical economists and their homo economicus, what a load of bullshit. Let's just topple that and come up with something else. Well, I mean, to me, I'm more of the sort of I'm more a kind of integrating kind of person. Okay, we've got this, we've got something else. Well, there's probably some truth in both. Let's see if we can combine this to something useful. And that applies as much in terms of philosophy and religion as in social sciences or just societal stuff, let's say.
Have you read any of Jonathan Haidt's work on like his The Righteous Mind, or any of that work where he's talking about the moral moral sediments, or
the moral sentiments?
Yeah.
Yes.
And the different components of which he's breaking it down around politics, and particularly U.S. politics. But there's the underlying innate moral components of fairness and sanctity, and I forget what some of the others are, but which again lends itself into some forms of tribalism around your beliefs around each of those. And yet, we look at this, we all have them, we just have them in different degrees. And so it lends itself to, again, maybe some of that integration and more of the homogeny if we can focus on what's the same as opposed to focusing on what's different. Anyway, just wondering if you had read any of his work.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think we have so much more in common. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all striving to be happy and to have a good life. And there are different ways of doing this. There's no point in trying to insist it has to be done this way or the other way. I mean, I remember a few years back in South Park, I think the exact circumstances, but there's 3 tribes of atheists. They all go back to Richard Dawkins, but they interpret him in different ways, and they sort of fight it. And it is absolutely hilarious how the makers of South Park think this. I mean, they just sort of send us as a whole human race up with these cartoons, and I think they hold us up a mirror, and I think we should just even learn from that. I mean, by the way, I think South Park is a great source of wisdom for me.
Well, South Park and The Simpsons, I think,
yes.
Both are these cartoons that kind of point out these natural weirdness of human nature that we are. And
we're not just good, we're good enough.
so anyway.
I want to get back to this environment question. Because the complexity in replication is one thing, but environment, as you said, the difference between, say, growing up in Rotterdam and being able to see for miles and miles and miles, versus growing up in Zurich, where all you're seeing are these mountains. How much of geographical diversity and environment is influential versus the life in our home and the way that we actually grow up? What do you think what do you think the influence is?
I think it's hard to disentangle it all. I mean, my hunch is that we get a lot from our very early years. That's when you get some real sense of the world. And I think maybe, and don't quote me on this, I don't have any grounding in psychology and even less in developmental psychology. But I think as a kid, there is not much there yet. So there's lots of space to put thoughts in, and therefore the thoughts take a lot of space in your mind. And as you grow older, then it gets sort of cut down to size and other things come in. But it's the bits that happen first that are perhaps most momentous and most profound in shaping your view of the world and your sense of right and wrong, those kind of things. And I think part of that is it mountains or is it flat fields? Another part of it is what kind of family are we? Do we look after each other? Is it a big family, a small family? Are parents strict? Are they more sort of laid back? All these kind of things. I think it all sort of melts together in one big soup, in a sense. I'm mixing my metaphors here. But I think it's hard to disentangle sort of family situation and geography, for instance. But I did some work with the European Commission, as it happens, nearly 20 years ago, on technology transfer between European countries.
Okay.
And to see how people develop technology, share it out, and adopt it. And part of that was looking at the different cultures. Then, of course, you see that in Southern Europe, people are more family-oriented than in North of Europe. And I mean extended family, not the single household, but the cousins and the uncles and aunts and everything. And I don't think that is by design. It's just by osmosis you pick that up. And therefore, your affinity with family and family values and taking the side of a family member in a conflict with somebody else will be stronger on average in Southern European countries than it is in Northern European countries.
Well, and you do a lot of work with organizational development.
Mm-hmm.
And so does that bleed into organizations? Is there something
Oh,
also?
absolutely. And I think that maybe that's also one of the reasons why I'm kind of I have a bit of a downer on this replication crisis, because in organization development, you can't just take something that worked with your previous client and your current client. I mean, obviously, there is such a thing as organizational culture. It's hard to grasp. It's like the judge in the Sanity case. I can't describe it, but I know it when I see it.
Yeah.
Culture is. So I think, I mean, to me, this is so natural that you have to almost start from first principles every time you go to a client. You need to understand how they tick. Is it a long-standing business? Is it a relatively young business? What management style? Is this with lots of people that have been there for a long time, so quite sort of steady and stable, or is there lots of in and out? All these kind of things. What industry are they working in? Are they working in a consumer industry where they're kind of used to responding very quickly? I worked with a company that enriches uranium.
Mm-hmm.
They have an order book stretching out 30 years into the future. 30 years. Can you imagine what that does to the way the company works? So people are out there selling capacity that will be used in 30 years' time.
Yeah.
Now, that is extreme, but it's the kind of thing that inevitably shapes the organization. So if you want to move something there, you need a different kind of force than if you work with a fast-moving consumer goods company.
Yeah, let's just say that the people at Google don't have those same considerations.
No, exactly. I mean, 30 years is like forever. It's unimaginable. And so all these things shape the context. And I think they will moderate and modulate whatever you want to do. And they may make it fail. So you come with something that you say, hey, this worked really well with company A, B, and C in the past. This is company D. This is going to work here as well. And it doesn't.
Yeah.
And then you need to figure out, well, how come? And then, yeah, you see, oh, yeah, that's probably why. Yeah, I mean, that's the way they work together. I didn't quite spot it early enough. And so you grow your understanding as you work there.
And it's interesting. So we do a lot of work with organizations as well. And one of the things that we see is even within the same industry, that same component, right? Company A is selling very similar drugs in a pharmaceutical industry than company, B, and yet their cultures are vastly different. And the interesting thing that we always hear is, well, just tell me what they were doing at company A so that we can do that, because that will make us better. And we're going,
that won't work.
Best practices are best practices. And yes, you can potentially use them, but they may not work, or they may work very differently in company B than they do in company A. And it is a constant struggle that we face and say, well, just do what you did over there. And we're going, but we can't. I mean, you could, but it's not going to get you the result that you want. So,
yeah. I'm reminded of something that you wrote. I'm looking through my notes here that made me think about this idea that we have this desire to, on one hand, we have this desire to just give me the information. It's company B saying, just tell me what company A did, and I'll do that. And at the same time, we also have this desire to say, well, what company A did, of course, won't work for what I'm going to do. So you can't port it over. I'm sure that you've seen this in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's neither. And I think that's why it's so important not to embrace any belief in that it will or it won't work too strongly. We need to keep an open mind, and certainly as practitioners, we need to keep an open mind as to what might or might not work. And I find it sometimes quite tricky to manage clients, particularly when they have a strong belief about it's got to be like this or it can be like that. So yeah, you develop a certain kind of diplomacy, I would say, in handling clients like that. So you can effectively do what you think is right. Survey the organization. I don't necessarily mean going around with a clipboard or sending people questionnaires, but get a sense of how they tick, and then come up with the right approach to whatever it is that you need to be doing.
Yeah.
I think reinventing the wheel is underrated. I think this is what we do. We reinvent the wheel all the time. Not the theoretical mathematical wheel with a line that is at the sort of equidistant of a point in the middle, but how we implement it to fit the organization. I mean, you're not going to get a Formula One car wheel on a unicycle. That's unlikely to work. Well, maybe actually it might work better because it might be a little more. Well, yes, we need to keep an open mind. So we shouldn't say it won't work. We should say, let's investigate. And that's why I think experimentation is so important in this work as well. It's not always easy because, of course, you don't normally have sample sizes or population that are big enough and that are easy enough to separate with a control group. But even so, I think you must find ways of at least testing your idea and be willing to learn whether it works or not. And if it doesn't work, you've learned something and you can move on.
Well, and I think that's one of the benefits of having a viewpoint, either by the scientific method or behavioral sciences, is coming in with the mindset of saying, we need to do some testing or some experimenting and to see, because again, we know humans and culture and environment and everything else that impacts, and your situation is different than situation, over here. And so we need to figure out what's going to work for you. And it's always amazing. I mean, even, as you look at some work that has been done and you say, wow, they changed just a few things. We just did an interview with Sarita Parikh, who is doing some work around improving the GED and getting people to continue on with their GED program. And they had done all this work with organizations that were doing this, and they put that in on their big thing, and they had redone their website, all this stuff. She's looking forward to, we had done all the right things. And then they got the first research back and it was
no effect.
No effect. Mm-hmm. And it's like, but then, they started experimenting and they tweaked just a few things. And all of a sudden they saw the results go up. But it was, again, you could have just left it there and said, oh, it's a failure. But what they did is they kept trying and iterating. So,
yeah. And I think in a sense, in a way, I prefer things to go wrong because then it forces you to ask the question, why not? Why did it not work? If it does work, of course it works. I'm such a genius. I came up with the greatest idea. So it works. And I think you learn more from when it fails than when it works well.
So what got you interested in the behavioral sciences?
Yeah, you have an engineering background, right?
Yeah, you're an engineer by training.
Yes, I am. And I rolled into management consultancy also almost by mistake. I joined a technical consultancy, assuming I was going to do some lab-based work and write software and stuff like that. But then this developed more into how do you get people working in product development to interface better with marketing and with manufacturing, and so that then became business process re-engineering. The word engineering in there, that's something for me. So I got it to that. But then as an engineer, you have kind of a bit of naive view of how organizations work. You look at the organization structure and you look at the arrows going between people and between the different departments. And then you find it doesn't quite work according to your expectations. And that's when this is a good 20, 25 years ago that I realized there was this sort of hidden dimension that I was unaware of, or at least not very familiar with. That's the people. And if you want to have a different result, you need to get people to change. You need them to do things differently. And that then became an ever bigger fascination. And that process is ongoing. Why do people do what they do? Why do they make the choice they make, and so on? And I'm still looking for the answer. I mean, there is not a single answer. I'm still looking to understand that better. And obviously, in my work, it's primarily in organizational change. When you have a restructuring or some kind of external or internally imposed change, whether it's a new software system or some kind of organizational moves, you want people to do things differently. And then how do you get them to do that? And interestingly, my first steps there were using insights from conventional economics rather than behavioral economics.
Okay.
I was looking at the sort of neoclassical view, if you like. Well, there are costs to something and benefits, and we weigh them up, and then we decide, well, it's worth it, so I'll do this, or it's not worth it, so I won't do it, and I will do something else. And that works to some extent, but only to some extent. And that was sort of the late 90s, early 2000s, when behavioral sciences began to penetrate, I wouldn't say the mainstream, but certainly began to show up at the edges of my peripheral sight, so to speak. And that was kind of the missing piece of the jigsaw. I'm still a great believer. I'm an accidental economist just as much as an accidental behavioral economist. So I'm still using insights from conventional economics in the sense that people make rational decisions a lot of the time. And often when they don't make the right decision or the decision you want is because they don't have the right information or they don't interpret it in the right way, but the mechanism itself is there. But then alongside, you've got other aspects like sort of beliefs where people simply don't weigh up anything at all and they just blindly follow a particular route because they think that is right. It's the only right way to do things. Or you have the sort of where people have weak preferences, just do whatever other people do or whatever is easiest, and that's where you get into the whole choice archetype. And I find that an extremely rich palette from which to mix your paint and construct or develop your painting in the client where you're working. You have a dollop of conventional economics and cost-benefit analysis. You have some heuristics and beliefs, like people habits that they follow, and then you have the other final color, sort of tricolor system with which you can work, and you can come up with both a way to diagnose a problem and then with a way to resolve the problem.
What is your recollection on what was the catalyst for getting you interested in the behavioral sciences? Do you remember, was there a specific paper you read or a piece or a talk?
I think it was the Thaler and Sunstein Libertarian Paternalism paper, 2003. Because at the time, I mean, obviously, when you work in organization development, in organization development, it's often translated as imposed change or desired change. So do you want to tell people what to do, or do you want them to want to change? And there is a sort of dichotomy, that kind of dichotomy you find in nudging as well. I mean, libertarian paternalism is kind of an oxymoron. Either you're free or somebody's deciding on your behalf. And that kind of tension resonated with me, as in, hey, I'm familiar with at least one instance of this kind of thing. So how do they go about this? And this whole idea of not doing something that's against the wishes of someone, not having any bribes, because that's often the way organizations work. Yeah, we'll give you a bonus if you do it right. We'll punish you. We'll sort of sack you if you don't do it. So that's I think when it began to dawn that there is something there that can be woven into this fabric I was working on, and that would be helpful for me.
That's true. I've been dominating the question.
No, that's okay. So Koen, I wanted to go, both Tim and I have talked about this, that we wish we would have been the authors of this article you wrote. There's more to behavioral economics than biases and policies, in which you're talking about there's been this, I don't know, kind of general movement to just behavioral economics is a list of biases that we have, and if you can just pick which bias is going to be applied here, then you've solved all the answers. And you dismantled that really nicely, and I think in a way that, again, that I definitely agree with. Can you help for our listeners who haven't read that, just kind of the general overview of what you were trying to say there?
Well, I mean, I think I'm a bit like an ex-smoker in that respect. People who have smoked before are the most fervent anti-tobacco. And I was taken in by some of these biases. I mean, you read Predictably Irrational and the other books by Ariely and sort of popular science type books, and you see this array of biases and fallacies, and you think, bloody hell! I mean, what are we doing here? We're wrong. There's so much wrong in how we operate. So, and you think that's all there is, because you're taken in by the sensational aspect of it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you realize, well, it's not that simple. There are many of these so-called and heuristics that are there for a good reason, that are there for have evolved with us and have served us well for a long time. And it's only, again, going back to what we were discussing earlier, is because we live in a different context now that these things are no longer necessarily always the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But there's much more nuance to the picture than just this whole stack of fallacies and biases.
Yeah, you wrote that a widespread misconception is that biases explain and produce behavior.
Yes. Yeah.
But they don't.
Yeah. No, of course, it's not because of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is just the name you give to a certain behavioral pattern.
Yeah.
So we've given it names, and it's a bit like trying to learn a language from a dictionary. Yeah, I know the translation of all these words, and now I can write poetry in Armenian or something. So it's that's not how it works. So you really need to get the context of it all. Yeah. And I think I was kind of happy with the increased attention that behavioral economics and behavioral science was getting in the media, so let's say 4 or 5 years ago and beyond. But it's been trivialized. And I'm not sure that's a good development. So I wish we could turn back the clock a little bit and say, hold on, we've got enough now. I mean, people have some idea what it is. Let's stop now and stop popularizing this sort of 5 ways why you will never do X or Y. 7 insights from behavioral sciences that will give you a better love life, and I mean all that kind of stuff.
The Cosmo, headline that it becomes.
So much crap out there. Yeah.
So,
yes.
What do you think about Richard Thaler winning the Nobel Prize in economics? Then is that a good thing for the behavioral sciences? Is it more getting into what you're talking about, where we tend to just take a couple? Nudging is now the new black.
Well, I think we should not overestimate the impact of a Nobel Prize on society as a whole. I think the Nobel Prizes have just been or are being announced one after the other this week. People say, "Oh yeah, another woman, fantastic," which is all great. But ask people in the street in 2 weeks' time who won the Nobel Peace Prize today, people will not remember and will not care one jot most of the time. So I don't think, in the wider scheme of things, Thaler's Nobel Prize has made all that much difference. Within the field of economics, I think it has. It has, in a sense, cemented what started with Kahneman, of course, in 2002. Well, he was not even an economist winning the Nobel Prize, so there's hope for me.
There you go.
Yes, there is.
But in all seriousness, I think it's kind of underscored that behavioral economics is a thing within economics. That said, I think Thaler writes it in Misbehaving as well. He sees behavioral economics being subsumed. It will cease to exist as soon as there is enough, as soon as economics has become as behavioral as it needs to be.
Yeah.
And I'm entirely aligned with that. I think that, again, the dichotomy is not helpful in its own right. I don't think we should maintain a sort of, there is neoclassical economics and behavioral economics and never the twain shall meet. I think the two shall come together and become one sensible combination of the two. and will continue to evolve in the same way as within economics. Of course, there are different schools of thought that conflict with each other, and out of conflict comes wisdom.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's again going back to you talking about at the very beginning, in looking at these things that aren't working, and then figuring out why they're not working the way that we had predicted them to do. And that's what, if economics is really about that study of humans interacting in the financial component, then yeah, the more information, and it should match up. It should overlap at some point. And I liked what Thaler said in Misbehaving, to your point of, at some point it's just going to be interwoven together, and it won't be behavioral economics, it won't be economics, it'll just be, economics.
Yeah. One of my favorite blog spots that you wrote was about the accidental behavioral economist on vacation, on holiday. And one of the reasons that I love it, Koen, is because of the number of things that you noticed. And I was wondering if you could just share some of these observations with our listeners, because as you went through, closing the patisserie, the cost of parking, the reputation, how reputation and risk go together, I thought it was just fascinating. Could you just share what it's like? I want to get inside the head of Koen Smets and just say, well, what is it like to be on holiday with you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can assure you that I don't talk about this all the time. It's more of an observational thing. But I really have to credit people like Tim Harford here, and Stephen Landsberg and Friedman on writing the sort of everyday economics type books. They have opened my eyes in the 1990s for the fact that we are economic beings. And I mean, just as a very small aside, a couple of days ago, I saw somebody tweet something about a survey they'd done with first-year economics students in London, and asked them for the kind of terms that people associate with economics. And this is people studying microeconomics. And the most important term, the most voted term was money. And I think you just alluded to it as well. And my heart sank, because I think economics is about so much more than money. It really is about human interaction. Yeah. It's about the kind of the stuff we trade, including reputation, including leisure time, including attention, including friendship. I mean, all these things are all part of how we weigh up the things that we do. And so when I'm on holiday, especially I'm often going back to Belgium, you see the kind of behavior that you think, that's interesting. Why would people do this? I mean, one of the things I described, I think, was a car being parked on the street, and central parking is very expensive. And then you see, well, I mean, it's going to cost the guy 20 or 25 euros a day to park the car. And every morning we went to the shop to get our pastries, and the car was in exactly the same position. So that car was parked there, probably within walking distance of the front door of where these people were staying. It was a German car, so it was definitely holidaymakers. And they were paying 25 euros a day for the car to be parked there without using it. So why would people do this? And so what kind of trade-off do they make? They could park the car, I don't know, half a mile up the road where it's free parking. And then whenever they needed it, they could walk over there, or one of them could go and fetch the car. But they don't. And so they're just paying this money. Now, it may well be that they think, well, we're paying, I don't know, several hundred euros for this week of holiday. So, I mean, this money to pay the parking for the car is not that much. But even so, if you add it up, I know a week at 20 euros a day is 140 euros. It's like $170, $180.
Yeah,
it's not peanuts. You could have a nice meal with that, or lots of ice cream on the seaside or whatever. And so have these people really thought about this, or is it just some kind of knee-jerk reaction? We must believe, if you like, we must have the car close to our front door, and yeah, we'll just pay whatever we need to pay for it. And I mean, the other thing about the reputation is about when you order bread at the shop.
Yeah, I love this story. Yeah, this is great.
You need to pay in advance, and of course, in where I live, in this provincial town in UK, there is there used to be a baker in town, but he's moved out, but he still supplies the bread to some local shops, to a local butcher here. So twice a week, I collect my bread. It's the best bread in the world. I won't name them. I won't make any sort of publicity here. So I don't need to pay in advance. I just say, well, I want a loaf on Saturdays and I want a loaf on Wednesdays, and I just pay the shop. And so it's all a matter of trust. Now, in this seaside town, if you want to order some bread rolls, some rolls, or some bread or something special, you need to pay up front. Why? Because you don't have a reputation there, and you can't get away with it. So they don't trust you. Whereas here there is trust. And again, this is an interesting observation, I think, for an accidental behavioral economist, to see how shopkeepers and tourists adopt different ways of interacting in a different environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's other things as well. There was this business about the bins being removed and the cost of that, because of course, in again, another thing, in Belgium, you need to pay for trash by buying bags. Expensive. So they're ordinary plastic bags, but you need to buy the right bag with the right inscription. It costs money. But when you're on holiday, of course, it doesn't work like that, because you're there for a week. Trash is collected on a Tuesday, but you're there until Saturday. So what do you do with the trash? So what people used to do is just sort of pack it up and under cover of darkness, go to the nearest bin and stuff their trash in a public bin. And so the municipality thought, well, we can't have this. You know what? We're just going to remove all the bins. So and then, of course, yes, people are now obliged to take their trash home. But of course, there is lots of littering because there are no bins. And so they have to employ larger teams to come and tidy the streets every morning. So is this wise thinking? I don't know. But it is intriguing to see the kind of guerrilla that takes place between the town and the tourists around trash.
Yeah, the unintended consequences of that. It's interesting because you talk about the difference of like being in your home and how you show up at holiday, and it gets into, you just wrote a blog about self-identity, and we've done some work with self-schemas, and you show up differently at your family than you do at work, and you have a different mindset of how that plays out. But you do have a different self-identity of yourself when you're on vacation. And so to your point, that the people from Germany with that parked car might have been in a whole, at home, they might have never, ever done that. But because they were on holiday, that could definitely be, well, it's okay now because this is our identity and we're free spirit, free spirits. And so and that gets into economic utility, and it gets into a whole number of other factors. And so it's fascinating stuff. So
can we talk about music? Can we talk about jazz? Can we talk about the altered chord? I want to hear about your life, or what did you say? When you grow up, you want to be a jazz musician.
Yes, that's right.
So was music your first love?
It probably was. Yes. Yes, the first girl I had a crush on. I must have been about 6, but I think I was in love with music before then.
That's terrific. And tell us about your affection for jazz specifically.
Well, I wasn't initially all that much into jazz. I mean, I grew up in the 60s. I was born in late 50s, so I was there, but I was very little. And I still think that there was an incredible richness in popular music in the 1960s. Some really great stuff being made, obviously with the people, but the whole thing that's part of that. Later on, I started exploring and discovering, I mean, particularly through jazz rock, then getting into jazz. And then maybe the last 20 years or so, getting much more into traditional jazz, but also modern jazz. But what I like about it, and of course this may all be motivated reasoning on my part, sort of just retrofitting things because it fits my story. But I think in jazz, mostly you have a groove, and that's it's the thing that gives you stability, it gives you something to hold on to. and then you've got stuff happening on top, and you've got your progressions, and they may be a bit unusual. Ooh, which way is it going here? And then you got your improv, and then you got your altered chords in there. You got your dissonance and your consonants, and I think it is very much a metaphor of life. I think if you look at it that way, I'm really conscious that I'm retrofitting it to my perspective of life, but it's still, I think, is relevant to me. And I once wrote a client report. This was a unit in Philips, which no longer exists right now, so I can talk really about it. But it was a bit of a maverick unit. They were at the time developing the DVD recording technology.
Okay, right. Yeah, Philips was one of the pioneers in DVD development.
Yeah, exactly. And they were a bit different. I mean, they didn't quite fit in the sort of corporate giant. And their boss was a bit of a maverick, and the team around him was a bit. But of course, they needed to conform to certain corporate processes in order to survive and thrive. And I don't normally do this, but I gave the report a title, and I called it "Conducting a Jazz Symphony."
Oh.
So, to reflect, I mean, a symphony orchestra is quite big, and of course needs a certain degree of discipline more than a three-piece jazz trio. Mm-hmm. But it's still, in that context, needed the freedom to experiment and to try things out and to improvise. And to me, that title, I mean, it just came to me in a flash. It's not something I've been pondering on for a long time, but it seemed to capture the tension that these guys needed to manage really well. And so that jazziness, I like to bring in my work as well, in order to help clients break out of the straitjackets of corporate procedures and corporate assumptions and structures.
So for us non-musical people, help me understand what an altered chord actually is. What is an altered chord? I don't know. Either of you. You guys are both musicians here.
Koen is our guest.
Well, I mean, as the name says, you alter certain notes in a chord. You have an ordinary chord. I mean, it's the kind of thing that if you sit in front of a piano keyboard, you play C, E, G, C, and that sounds nice. Yeah. But it sounds a bit boring. And then so it's four notes.
Well, it's like the consonant, right? It's dominant, so it's easy.
Yeah. And then you start, if you start moving some notes around, then you start creating dissonance, but it's mellifluous dissonance. It sounds good. Now, that is, of course, a matter of taste. I think what we today think sounds good, people 100 years ago would not have agreed with.
Okay.
There is an evolution in our musical ability, even in general terms, the kind of stuff that we are familiar with. So we are more tolerant, I think, of dissonance than people were 100 or 200 years ago, and you hear it in classical as well. But to me, the altered chord is a way of expressing the value of diversity and the richness diversity can create. So if you don't stick to your 1-3-5 construction of a chord, you create something that sounds more interesting and much richer. And I think we can do the same thing in organizations.
So I make altered chords all the time when I
and that's why your life is so rich.
That's just because I don't know. But so on that, and this is going down a rabbit hole here. There was, do you need to have a level of expertise? And we've talked about this before, where the beginner is going to be playing just straight chords, and are they able to do an altered chord that, to your point, Koen, sounds good, or is it just going to be a mistake then? And at what level do you need to get until that time comes when the altered chord is actually intentional and not a mistake? And you can take the same thing for your life metaphor, right? And so how much do you have to stay in that groove, which is what I understand, and how much then do you
I'm not sure the distinction between intentionality and mistakenness is relevant, because who knows? If I'm playing, do you know whether I'm playing a mistake or whether it's intentional?
That's a very good point.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that I think I may have picked this up at a very early presentation skills course when I first became a management consultant. When, of course, I mean, you've prepared your slides and your speech and everything, and you think, oh, what if I forget? And the tutor said, well, who knows that you've forgotten something? You're the only person who knows. And suddenly, I mean, this is like a sort of an incredible truth that dawned on me. Yes, of course. They don't know what I'm going to say. So if I don't say anything, they don't know whether I've forgotten something or simply. And I think it's the same with mistakes, certainly in jazz music. I mean, there are no mistakes in jazz music. It's just another note that leads to another note. So I think, and as I suppose this we can loop this back again, as you can do with anything, of course, to this first discussion on replication crisis. Well, something goes wrong, but it points the way at something else, and we should embrace these mistakes and these things that are not right or not as we expected, and see what we can do, what we can get out of it, and where does it lead. And let's go there.
So that's kind of my understanding of jazz, then, which I am not, seeped in at all. Is that's what that is, right? Then you play off of that, as opposed to everybody shutting down or looking and going, what did you just do? And
the band doesn't stop.
Right.
You keep going. You continue to improvise through it.
And again, it's a wonderful metaphor, however you want to call it. But to that point, to what you just said, Replication Crisis or life in general, where do we go from there? How do we then take that and build it into something that can actually be better or different or more robust, and all of those factors as we're going forward with that. So, all right, well, we're coming to a point where if you had to give 2 or 3 pieces of advice or tips to the listeners on ways that they can, insights that you have from life or behavioral science or whatever it would be, what would be 2 or 3 things that you would say, here's some sage wisdom that you can take and use?
That's a hard one, and like this. But I think maybe number 1 would be pretty much everything is behavior.
Okay.
So if something is not the way you want it to be or you expect it to be, the first place to go and look for is, well, what are the behaviors and why are these behaviors there? So try to understand the situation from the behaviors of the people that are involved. There's more than one way to skin a cat. Do not think that anything that you've learned is the be-all and end-all. Truth is an emerging concept. It doesn't exist in its own right. It develops out of stuff that happens. So you don't go look for it. It just happens in front of your eyes. I think. So don't assume that you find the truth somewhere and now all you need to do is to go and apply it.
We have a bias. We can apply it everywhere.
Yes. And maybe a third one is probably the most important one. Don't ever take yourself too seriously.
Well, Tim and I do not have that problem.
We can't. we have too much in our way to ever take ourselves too seriously.
I think that is some wonderful sage advice. So, Koen, thank you. We appreciate this. This has been fun. It has been insightful, and we're excited. So
we are. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us on the Behavioral Groups podcast.
Thank you very much, Tim and Kurt. I think it's been tremendous. I had no idea what to expect, but it's been absolute fun. Thank you very much.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our Behavioral Groups interview, have a free-flowing discussion on some of those topics, and whatever else comes into our now recently oxygen-deprived brains.
Yeah, after coming down from 32,000 feet.
Yeah, we were just at a conference out in New York City talking all things behavioral science.
Yeah, it was fun.
It was a good conference. So, but with that, let's talk about the interview with Koen. Tim, what were some of the things that you found really fascinating?
Well, first, I just loved the conversation with him. It was just so fun, so easy, so just a really great conversation overall. So I just want to say that. But the one of the things that really struck me is that you can't really learn about behavioral sciences just by learning the biases and heuristics.
You can't learn a language by reading a dictionary and in that language. There are nuances. There are facets of how you use those terms and when they apply and when they don't apply. And
there's context.
There's context in the context of how you put all of that together.
Yeah, and practice, right? I mean, there's actually just getting out in the field and doing it. And I feel like that's one of the most important things is observing and then testing and all. This was implied, right?
Okay.
But what I felt like Koen was implying there was we've got to get out and do it. We have to test and we have to measure and that's when we learn about to take it back to language. We learn about language by trying it, by having a conversation, by seeing what it's like. We learn about behavioral sciences by doing it, by making some applications and seeing how things work.
So, do you think that is not the current way that many people are using behavioral science? That they are literally looking at it as a dictionary and saying, here's a behavioral bias, here is a heuristic, and plopping those on?
Yeah. I saw a WebEx presentation just a couple of weeks ago by a company that will go unnamed that they said, okay, so we know that people have loss aversion. So when you when you encounter loss aversion with one person, then you use the endowment effect to counteract that. It's like, no, it's not a chess game or not even a checkers game. It's just not that predictable. People are living in environments and, as Koen said, what did he say about growing up in Switzerland absolutely informs you differently than growing up in Brussels.
In Brussels, yeah. So that the mindset that people come into a situation, the culture that your organization has, that lends itself right into the conversation that he was talking about in regards to organizations. And too often how a best practice gets put in place in companies A and B, and wow, it works really good. So now company C is going to come in and do the exact same best practice, but it doesn't work.
Michael Halsworth. Right?
Oh, there we go. Yeah,
we
did a whole
his work with the British Insights team demonstrates that perfectly, right?
Right.
It just doesn't work everywhere. Or you have a great example of the replicating the test in both the West Coast and in Atlanta. Right?
Yes, and we talked about that. So, it's one of those components where you, depending upon what is primed, and then the cultural components, it can have a very different outcome.
Yeah.
Same thing with best practices. The piece that I think, and this is something we heard in a lot of the conversations at both of the recent conferences we've been at, is the need to test. That we too often make these broad generalizations about some of these very same biases or heuristics and the application that they have in a general sense, and that we really need to do a better job both as practitioners, actually as practitioners, not both as practitioners, as practitioners, when we are going into organizations or if organizations are trying to apply some of these components in, to saying, let's take a more cautious or maybe a slower approach to this and do some testing, do some experimentation.
Very much so.
And I know when we talked with Charlotte Blank, confusing adding two of our wonderful guests together.
Yes, wow.
But when we talked to Charlotte, you just changing the word experiment to pilot was one of the suggestions that she had. And I think we don't do that enough. I think we really need to do that more in business and in the application of this.
The other thing that Koen had once written in a paper, he said that it's unwise to take an observe effect as gospel.
Oh.
And it is equally unwise to take a single failed replication as proof that what was originally observed doesn't exist. So just because there's different impact between the study in the West Coast and the study in Atlanta, Georgia, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Right, that is not
that effect is real.
That is not and so the replication crisis, so-called replication crisis, was another big thing. And I loved that component that you just said. And the way that we talked about this is saying, you have to replicate that experiment in such a way that it is almost exactly perfect in order to really make sure that it's a replication. Right. And so at the conference, I had the chance to walk with Bob Cialdini and talk with him. And so as part of that conversation, we started talking about this. And
it's topical for him.
It was topical for him. And we were talking about the fact that if you can't, we talked about the priming thing with John Bard, and how again it has the aging study where they prime them with age words and then measured how fast they walked down the hallway. And what he brought up, which I thought was really interesting, Cialdini brought up was, he said, look, what did they see out in the hallway? Did they get a subsequent prime? Either maybe before leaving the room, maybe there was a different picture up that caught people's attention that wasn't in the first study. Maybe there was a
brighter lights,
attractive person in the hallway that again changed their prime. So it's not knowing these things, and again, there's some truth in that. There's also this component where we tend to take these findings from these studies, these effects, and broadly generalize them across this wide swath of every known human in the world has this. And I would love to be able to do that. But I don't think we should, because the research doesn't necessarily point that out. And what I love about the replication crisis, so-called crisis, or any time that an experiment doesn't replicate exactly, is it lends itself to providing further insight into when and where that effect is working.
Well said.
And how it works. Yeah. And so this isn't a crisis. This is how science works.
What did Edison say? After he finally found that piece of cotton filament that would keep the light bulb burning, he said, well, I've just discovered 10,000 ways to not keep a light bulb burning.
Yeah.
And those are important discoveries.
They are important discoveries. It's one of those pieces. My gosh, that lack of oxygen is really
it's hitting us both right now.
So
it doesn't help that we just downed a fifth of Jameson and it's midnight, but actually, I just made that up. That wasn't true.
We ought to do one of these after a fifth of Jameson at midnight. God. Would that not be fun? Would that not be either a total bomb or it would be the most wonderful grooving session ever?
We need a good sound engineer for that one.
Anyway, replication is really, I agree with Koen. I don't think it's a crisis. I agree with Bob Cialdini. I don't think it's a crisis.
It's not.
I think it is the scientific method working, and we are finding more information out about that.
Okay. What was your number one thing that... I'm sorry, you just said a whole bunch of really cool things, but you had asked me, and then you just dogpiled onto my thing, and now I'm just asking you, what was your number one thing? Or did we already talk about it?
Well, no. I think we talked about my number one thing.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, the replication thing was my number one thing.
All right.
But my number two thing that I loved was the concept or metaphor of a jazz symphony. Now, again, I'm not the musician, so I had to really think about this. And you guys explained it
So this is
really
where
well.
opposites attract? Is that it?
Well, I don't know about that. What I was thinking about was this fact, and you explained it really well, at least to me as we were talking about this, is that, experimentation and yet at the same time being directed.
Yeah.
And those two kind of are counterfactual or counterintuitive things.
They can appear like they're opposite ends, but they don't have to be. And that's the cool thing about jazz, is that in jazz they work closely together. You have to have both. You have to agree that we're going to start with a form and we're going to go in this particular direction to start with, but then anything can happen.
But isn't the symphony part of it being directed with a director who is leading it?
Yes.
And so the concept is you have this person leading things, but within that symphony there's experimentation that goes on, which lends itself into the whole concept of an altered chord.
Altered chord. Back to the altered. You dig that. You dig the altered chord.
I just think it's and again, we talked about this in the interview. Is an altered chord if it's just a mistake, or is it an altered chord only if it's intentionally altered?
That's
and
interesting.
Koen's top on that, or his thought was, doesn't matter.
Right.
Because the only person, at least in that jazz component where they do altered, where he was thinking about altered chords, is who knows if it was an accident. The only person that knows is you, the person who's actually doing it. But the listeners don't know. And so the end result is there. I don't know if I would take that analogy further out into other realms where you're trying to do an altered chord and say your design of an incentive program or something and adding in a slight twist or change. And if you did it by accident, I don't know. Now I'm thinking about that, and I might be, if it was an accident and it worked out well, maybe that's okay.
Okay, but we're down from 32,000 feet, so. and
I don't know. It sounds like you're still up there.
I might be. Okay, so I also wanted to talk about context matters.
Okay.
And how, because this is a tie-in here. So Koen talked about the uranium builders, the people who are enriching uranium that's going to be used 30 years in the future. And that came to me while we were in New York at the summit, and Eric Johnson, the tremendous professor and researcher, talked about how the average age of buildings in the southern half of New York City is 95 years old. The average age is 95 years old. So buildings in New York City are old, and there's no way that for me, there's just no way to imagine that someone who's building a building today could say the infrastructure around it, the way people are use it, the number of people who will use it, heating, lighting, HVAC, the cars on the street,
garbage collection, which in New York we talked about, right? And the fact that they throw the garbage out on the sidewalk, and I go, there was no design for that back when
150 years ago.
Yeah.
It just wasn't available. So context, so while it's great to think about the future, it's still really, really hard for us humans to get our heads around anything other than the present.
Yeah. Well, we talked with Barry Richholtz, right? And one of the things that he was talking about from that perspective is he's a financier and talking about a number of different things, but he's talking about we really just live in the now. And the future we can try to envision, but we usually only envision a couple futures for ourselves, and they're usually pretty positive futures for ourselves.
Yeah.
But there's really an infinity of futures out there, of which ones come true. We don't have any real clue as to
which ones.
To which ones. There's
there might be we can't anticipate all the eventualities.
There might be a greater percentage on some than on others, but in reality, it's all guess. And so living in the now and here. That being said, to your point of context matters, context of now influencing the context of what we then are working with 20 years down the road, 30 years, 50
Absolutely
years.
makes a difference.
So how do...
Because we are living in New York City, millions and millions of people are living with streets and infrastructure that was built 100 years ago.
So how do we then take that so to Eric, Johnson's point, try to anticipate for that future? How do we do that? Because that while it may be hard, might even be impossible. Is the effort worth it? Is there a way of doing that is something that we should strive for?
Let's get Eric Johnson on a podcast and ask him that very question.
All right, we should do that. You just didn't want to answer. So, all right.
What's wrong with that?
All right.
This is
all right.
That's
no,
a hard
that's
question.
a great thing. We'll get it. Anybody
That's a
know?
System 2
If anybody
question.
knows Eric and wants to get an invite out, we'll.
Yes, that'd be
we
great.
would love to talk to him about that. So, I mentioned before I don't know much about jazz.
But you knew something about jazz.
I know the Dave Brubeck group or Five or whatever. Take Five.
Take Five, yeah, right.
And maybe a Dizzy Gillespie song. But I'm not a jazz guy. So help
That's
me
okay.
understand so tell me about jazz.
Well, there's one thing that everybody should know is that jazz is a uniquely American created form of music.
Okay.
So, I mean, we have, like, music has been created in all cultures, throughout all of history. And the United States, as a conglomerate, as a melting pot of all these different cultures, didn't really have anything that was unique until the early 20th century when jazz was created. So that's really the United States' kind of only contribution to music.
So jazz
is jazz.
So jazz is the basketball of sports.
Of music, maybe.
Well,
right.
So jazz is the basketball of music. There we go. Sorry, yeah. Because basketball
didn't exist anywhere else.
Where like even American football is kind of a little thing off of rugby. Baseball has some other, starts
Cricket.
in some cricket and various different things.
Yeah.
Hockey is definitely not American.
I thought basketball came from like the Romans when they cut off the heads of their rivals and then they threw them into baskets. Wasn't there something like that?
No.
Isn't that what basketball
It was John
came from?
Naismith putting peach baskets up in the YMCA.
Right.
Come on.
Oh, okay. So it was peach baskets. It was a basket. It just wasn't the heads of your rivals.
Oh my God. And we digress. Okay. So jazz was uniquely American. What else do we need to know?
Well, I think for me, I think that jazz as an art form influencing the whole world. So we talk about Koen talks about the Altered Chord. We'll actually get back to Koen here. He talks about the Altered Chord. If we take music history and we look at the literature from the earliest days of music that was recorded and I'm just going to talk about Western music. This is Western civilization, so music that came basically from Western Europe.
Fine.
I'm
that way.
I'm limiting it. I'm sorry, but if we just look at that kind of music, the first music was organum. It was just one note at a time. It was just very, very simple, and that was about as complicated as we can get. That's
about as complicated as I can get. So.
Yeah, so that was like that lived for possibly thousands of years up until about the year 1000 in Common Era. And then we start experimenting with more than one note at a time. It becomes polyphonic. So now we have two notes at the same time, and that's when we start creating chords. And that's a major, major development. And then we get to the 1500s, and now we've got Bach and Handel, and we've got people creating magnificent chords, but mostly out of three notes at a time.
Okay.
And that pretty much stays the same up until the end of the 19th century when the serious composers start saying, there's 12 tones in a scale. Let's actually use all 12 tones in the composition of the piece. And so dodecaphonic music was created so that the composers could just expand the way that they're using tonal music. And then jazz sits on top of that saying, we've got a palette that is everything. We're going to change up all the melody. We're going to change up all of the tempos. And so jazz was like this, in some ways, this beautiful culmination and application of magnificent efforts to develop music through all of human history.
And we just got a grooving lesson of musical history. That was actually, I am actually really, I did not know that it took until, the year 1000 in order to get chords, and then really
took a long time.
Basically 3 chords up until whatever. That's crazy. That's crazy.
So
Just crazy.
I didn't realize that was going to come out like that, but we didn't rehearse the question either.
We never rehearse the questions.
Actually, we never rehearse. We could just leave it there.
And maybe we should, but that's a whole separate conversation.
So thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you for listening. Hopefully you enjoyed our interview with Koen Smets and our, way back memory into music history. If you did, please go out and rate us high on iTunes. iTunes, we're finding out more and more, is kind of the bellwether one.
Yeah.
So even if you don't have an iPhone, you can go out and you can just go to, on most computers, to your iTunes thing and rate us highly there. Please do that. And if you would like, please go ahead and leave a review. We would love to have.
Didn't we just ask for that? You mean
actually writing a review, not just a 5-star rating, which of course they would give us.
Write a review. Okay.
Write a review, and it could be something like, "These guys are awesome!" Exclamation point! Exclamation point! Exclamation point! That would be fine. You can take that and use it and put your own name to it. I'm fine with that.
I think that so now you're priming our listeners. Is that what you're doing?
I'm giving them easy ways.
These are the tools to.
These are some tools.
You're making it frictionless.
Behavioral Grooves is the best podcast on behavioral science in the entire world. Quote unquote. Done. You can write that. Get it out there.
It's
all right. That might be a lie, but
it's yours for the taking.
You can take it and use it if you believe that. We'll go for it. So
I'm just hoping someone believes that.
I just hope somebody takes us up on the stupid going, "Oh, these guys are idiots," but I'm going to do this anyway. There you go.
Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.